Welcome to Early, the podcast about the business of Web3 from Bankless Consulting. I'm your host, D-Side. Today, my special guest is Nimit Sawhney. Nimit is the co-founder and CEO of Voatz. That's V-O-A-T-Z, a business founded on the idea that voting should be easy, secure, and accessible for everyone. Voatz is looking to revolutionize the way the world votes. Platform hosts a voting system that is completely functional on tablets and smartphones by combining elements of remote identity proofing, biometrics, and blockchain technology. End-to-end verifiable and accessible remote voting is now an option thanks to this technology. Nimit's areas of expertise stretch over mobile software development, cryptocurrency development, cybersecurity, and public policy. He co-founded Voatz in 2015, and the platform has since been used to run over 117 elections at the state, county, university, and organizational levels, serving over 2.2 million voters. Voatz has stayed true to its mission of promoting the maintenance of a platform that truly allows the public's opinion to matter in governance. Nimit, good to see you today. Thanks for joining me.
Nice to meet you as well, Eastside.
Yeah. Give us a little background on yourself. How did you get to, you're the CEO of Voatz, V-O-A-T-Z. Give us a little background on Voatz and how it came to be.
Sure, happy to. So Voatz began somewhat by accident. My brother and I were at a hackathon competition at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, many years ago. The theme of the hackathon was Hack to the Future. What's the one thing you would do in the future and how would you do it? And we ended up prototyping a new election system from scratch that used smartphones, biometric security, remote ID proofing, and used blockchain-based infrastructure in a unique way. So we ended up winning the first prize, and that kind of led to a few events, which ended up being the company called Voatz. And my personal background is in cybersecurity, mobile security.
Okay. So did you have a background in blockchain at all before that?
No, we didn't. So this was the early days in 2014. And so what really intrigued us was the prize. They had the usual, cash prize and swag and all, but they also had a Bitcoin. So we were very intrigued why someone's giving that as a prize. So we actually read the paper the morning of the competition, and we were very intrigued. And so it was just by chance we ended up then learning more, and the data security aspect of a blockchain-based infrastructure really appealed to us, and thought elections would be a good use case for that.
That's great. So you won the Bitcoin.
Yes, we won the first prize and the Bitcoin. Yes.
Do you remember how much it was worth at the time?
I do. Probably like $240 or something like that.
Oh my goodness! You can buy a lot of Bitcoin for that right now.
Yes.
Yeah. Did you build it for a particular blockchain, or was there like a thought in mind on how that would work? I mean, I suppose there weren't many options at the time, but
yeah, initially we were planning to build everything on the Bitcoin chain.
Sure.
And as we started diving in deeper, talking to election officials, some legal experts as well, one thing kind of stood out was the data residency requirement, that the data for a US election has to be on a US based something which is within the borders of the US. And with a chain like Bitcoin, it's just no way for us to guarantee that, because a node could be running anywhere in the world. So then we kind of went back to the drawing board and say, how can we build this governance layer? And we started using an open source framework at the time, which was called Hyperledger, specifically Hyperledger Fabric. I think IBM had just open sourced it, and now it's
Mhm.
kind of managed by the Linux Foundation. So we then built the whole system on that, and all the elections we've done have been run on the Hyperledger network. We have a 64-node network in the US, but we are still trying to convince election officials to use a fully public network. I think that'll happen at some point in the future.
Sure. So you've run over 117 elections on Voatz, right? What are some examples? Like who has used Voatz for their elections?
So our first governmental election was in 2018. We worked with the state of West Virginia for the midterm primary elections in a couple of counties. It started with a very small group of people, just voters from the military. And then they expanded it in the fall, in the midterm general, to more counties. And so initially, it was only available to military voters and US citizens living overseas.
Makes sense.
And now in several states, voters with disabilities are also allowed to use our system. So
Okay.
it's been used successfully in 5 states, 32 counties in the US for public elections. And then both the major parties have also used the system for their party elections in 6 states as well. And then in addition, in Canada, 15 cities have recently used the system in Ontario for their municipal elections, where every voter is allowed to use our system, not just
Everybody's allowed, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So, but it's and typically it's used, at least at this point, as an option. It's not mandatory that people use it, but it's in each of these cases, right? It's an option.
Right. Yeah, voters have a choice. So you have the choice to vote in person, mark a paper ballot, like you've done in the past. In many jurisdictions, you can also use your postal ballot. So request the ballot by post, mark it, and mail it. And then this is the third option. So you always have a choice. You don't nobody's forcing you to use our system for public elections, and that's good, because voters should have as much choice as possible and let them pick whatever is most convenient for them. Yeah.
I like that platform. It does certainly solve, I mean, maybe in the future where it's maybe enforced as a way to vote remotely. I know that there, over the years, there have been contentions from both sides that absentee ballots may or may not be legit in certain situations, and fake ballots and fake mail-ins and difficulty, whatever else. It certainly solves for that.
Absolutely, because every voter has to go through a verification process. So you have to scan an ID, take a selfie that matches that to the voter roll, make sure you're actually eligible, then pulls the right ballot style, and then all your personal data is actually deleted, so it's not stored or shared with a third party. So it does make sure you are who you say you are, ties your identity to the phone, and then anonymizes everything when you mark and submit. So in that sense, it's way more secure than some of the other methods.
What kind of pushback have you gotten?
I think there's the general cybersecurity related concern, right? Where there are people who are constantly afraid of anything happening on the internet, and so the idea of voting over the internet is very kind of abhorrent to them. So they kind of conveniently miss or glean over the fact that a lot has changed in the past few years. Consumer devices are arguably way more safer than a traditional computer. They've got hardware-based security. Plus, it's no longer possible to do a mass attack. Like, you can go in one database and alter the election, so to speak. So there's quite a bit of fear and misinformation spread in the news from the cybersecurity perspective. So I'd say that's That's probably the foremost challenge. The other challenge is somewhat on the legal and regulatory front. In the US specifically, in several states, until the law gets amended, no one can use our system.
Right.
So even military voters cannot use our system. So getting each state step by step to at least start accommodating voters who need our system the most and could benefit from it the most.
Yep.
That's the first step. So we've had good success in some states, but still many other states, there's that legal and regulatory aspect which moves slowly and much slower than you might like. Unlike other countries where there is a central authority which can make changes throughout. Here, because elections are run by the states, so it's state by state.
Sure.
And the last challenge I would say is kind of linked to the first one, where sometimes partisan politics gets in the way of doing good things and doing the right things. And people who have successfully used that system for their party elections suddenly become hypocritical and say, oh, it's okay for us, but it's not okay for you. So there's a bit of that as well. But yeah, it's primarily the first two reasons.
Not pointing at any fingers at either party.
Right.
What's your contention as to the benefits of votes and on-chain voting versus traditional voting systems?
I think there are a few really nice benefits to using a system like ours. One is accessibility. So we talked about that briefly. Voters who can't hand mark a paper ballot or may not be able to return a postal ballot by mail, this is very convenient and safer option for them. They can track everything, make sure their ballot gets in before 8 p.m. and actually would get counted. The other one is auditability. So for the first time, you as a voter are able to audit your ballot. And then even if you didn't vote, you can audit the election as an independent voter, as an independent auditor. So that's really, really important because we live in a time of extreme mistrust in traditionally trusted institutions. And so this can be a way to restore trust by letting every voter get a receipt, go to the chain of the bulletin board, make sure your ballot made it okay, was counted, wasn't tampered with. So from a voter trust building perspective, I think it can be a really good tool. The third aspect is because of the distributed ledger-based infrastructure, there is no single point of failure anymore. So there's no like one or two servers you go and attack and suddenly the whole election's compromised.
Sure.
You can try attacking a few nodes of the chain if you can find them. Then what happens is if something happens to them, a new set of nodes will automatically come up, almost like a whack-a-mole kind of thing. And so it's really, really hard to disrupt the election. No single point of failure. And then you now have potentially millions of consumer devices, and you can't really break into all of them with just one click. Even in case of a zero-day type of attack, you literally have to break into each device individually. So what has happened is the cost for an attacker, cost as in time and actually resources, is now exponentially harder than before. So the combination of this and the fact that it can still produce a paper ballot for tabulation, I think that, in our opinion, makes it a very good option.
And what's the method for the network, decentralized network, being? How is it secured?
So every node is basically like a Linux machine. It can be a bare metal, or if you have a virtual machine, or you can even potentially run it on a any other kind of hardware as well. So they are independently tested. So it's the standard binary, and then you have to go through a basic cyber security hygiene check where, make sure everything's, as per the, at least the baseline guidelines. And then if something happens to a node, it immediately, gets disconnected, because there are sentinels who are tracking everything for suspicious activity. And so that way, the integrity of the nodes is maintained. And there are various kinds of permissions available. So obviously the voter, and using the device of the voter, they have right access to the node. The election officials have the ability to, seed the election and then, close the election. And then there are auditors who have the ability to, monitor what's going on, and everybody else has read access. So that kind of permission chain, layered permission, and still being a public network.
Yeah.
So that's why we call it as a public permission network. That kind of gives you the benefits of a distributed ledger infrastructure, but also has a governance layer, which is important for a use case like elections, where you want to make sure the nodes are in the country where the election is happening, so that nobody can say, oh, you were running a node in an unfriendly part of the world, I don't trust this election anymore, right? So you want to keep minimize the objections for the naysayers.
Yeah. And you mentioned US and Canada. Have you done elections in other countries as well?
Yes, so we've done elections in 6 countries so far. So the other ones where we've done elections are in the Philippines. We did a pilot there in 2021, which was very successful. Looking forward to doing a bigger election soon. Early this year, we did our first election in Europe, in the country of Georgia. It was very fascinating. Almost 50,000 people used the system. Then we've done a big one in South America, where 1.5+ million people use the system.
Wow.
In Venezuela, and then a small one in Brazil as well. So slowly sort of expanding our wings, but most of our work so far has been in the US and Canada.
And for each of those elections, you have nodes in those countries? And how do you know?
Yeah, so we were able to set up nodes, for example, for Brazil. In Brazil, we set up a network on AWS as an example.
Mm-hmm.
We use both AWS and Azure. So there we can quickly set up a network which corresponds and conforms to the data residency requirements. For the other countries, they did not insist on a data residency requirement as yet. So we were able to serve them from our nodes in Zurich, in Switzerland, for example. So that covers the entire EU region. So it's still within Europe, but it doesn't have to be in a specific country, because they have the data sharing agreements.
Sounds neutral to me.
Yeah.
Switzerland. But forgive me for my lack of technological know-how, but wouldn't it be possible for a node or a host to use a VPN and or are you hosting all the nodes?
So they have to download, any node operator has to download sort of a certified node binary. And they have to go through a cyber hygiene where the vetting is done. So if somebody tries to use a VPN in front of their node, they will get disconnected.
Got it. Okay. And in these other countries, voting is obviously, it's a major issue in other countries more than in the United States in terms of like the validity of elections, right? I mean, it's been well documented that existing governments they've stolen elections. It's very common practice, or it has been over the years. Like, why would a government that and Venezuela is actually a good example. I'm curious about like how you pitched it to the country of Venezuela, where there's possibilities of, I don't know, one side or the other trying to steal an election.
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, if an election management body in a specific jurisdiction wants to do any kind of hanky panky, then they won't use our system, because it's designed for the exact opposite reason, that you shouldn't be able to do anything like that, right? So you're right. There are some parts of the world which would never use our system, and that's okay, right? With regards to Venezuela, so it was a very interesting project. So this happened in the fall of 2020. At that time, Venezuela had basically two governments. There is the incumbent government, which was largely de-recognized by most of the world. And there was a sort of a opposition government led by President Guaido and the National Assembly as well. So they collaborated with a group of international organizations to conduct this large referendum for people in country as well as citizens who are living across the world in 60 other countries. And so they were able to independently do that without relying on, the government in country. So it was kind of an interesting scenario, very unusual, where a country has two governments. One is recognized, one is not. So obviously, the government in country, which was de-recognized, would not use our system. But the other one did, because they wanted an international project. They wanted transparency. They actually wanted to show that they have support from the people. So it ended up being a very successful project. Almost 4 to 5 million people ended up voting globally, including a lot of people in country. And so digital voting, it was almost 1.7 million people used their transactions went through our system, and the remaining voted in person. So it's a good example. If you want to do a transparent project at scale, you can do it despite it being very challenging.
Yeah. And you have a background in public policy, right?
A little bit. I mean, I studied a little bit about it in college, but I'm more of a engineer, and try to think about what are the sort of implications from a cybersecurity perspective and a larger societal perspective, but I'm not an expert by any means.
Well, I mean, having some background in public policy, certainly I have to imagine it's applicable here. And I'm a firm believer that technology and culture need to speak to each other for advancement of society in general, right? So the engineer side of you and the science doesn't, it only goes so far, like so I don't know. I mean, is there sort of a subconscious part of your brain that is operating on that public policy background a little bit to apply to this?
Yeah. I mean, there's always interesting challenges and counterpoints which come up. So just a really good example is the concept of scanning an ID to get verified before you're allowed to vote, right?
Sure.
A lot of people instantly take that to be voter ID, and then by definition it's something discriminatory, right? So that's kind of the knee-jerk reaction. Oh, you're asking for my ID, you want to discriminate against me, so I don't like you, right? So it's very quick. It's kind of a few seconds. And so how do you then go back to them and say, hey, hold on, that's not true. No one's trying to discriminate against you. This is, if you want to vote on the phone, get the convenience, we have to know who you are. Your county or your elections office needs to know you are who you are, who you say you are. You're the person who's registered to vote. And so just like you need an ID to get into a government building, you need an ID to get into a plane. This is that. It's not discrimination. It's just the process, right? So once people listen to that and kind of digest it, they're like, okay, this is actually not, not what you hear in the news. There's no discrimination. It's actually a part of the process. And then there will be some people, particularly in some parts of the country, who don't have an ID, right?
Sure.
Although that number is shrinking, it's very, very small now, but they're there. They're there. Someone who never really needed an ID. And so now, if they want to use our system, they don't have an ID. So how do you help them? You can't say, hey, you don't have an ID, so, go do some other method of voting. I mean, this could be an elderly person at home who can't go to the polling station, who doesn't have anybody to help him or her mark a paper ballot. They are the perfect candidate for our system, right? So how do you get them in? So what we've tried to do is we've actually helped some voters get IDs. So if you don't have an ID, we will either through local aid organizations or ourselves help you get an ID. Once you have an ID, bingo, you can use our system.
Yeah.
So I think you're right, thinking of it slightly outside the box and say, okay, how do you help people in terms of what circumstance they are in? I think that's always helpful. I mean, a lot of times people who are building technology don't have a chance to think about that, but fortunately we've had that opportunity, so it's always helpful.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, like, is there a tie-in? Well, do you see a future where verification for voters might come through a wallet, just strictly through a wallet address? And how does that tie into KYC and I guess the existing systems in proof of identity?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely possible. So one of the reasons we have to do what we are doing right now is because the US doesn't really have a singular national ID.
That's
right?
right.
The closest you can come to is a passport, but a third of the country has a passport, right?
That's right.
So you can't use it as a universal ID. So what if it's not the passport, then what else is it? It's driver's licenses or state IDs in all the states. So you've got 50 different variances now. So the private sector has now started to do the government's work. I mean, take the example of Estonia, right? So Estonia is a small country, but one of the really nice things they did early on was they gave every citizen a digital ID. So you get this card which you can plug into the computer, and then you can vote, you can do taxes, everything, like 30 different government services, because they built that baseline ID infrastructure. So if the future of that in the US ends up being something like you said on a wallet or some new system which we don't know yet about, it would make a lot of sense to integrate that into the e-governance process, into the voting process. So absolutely, if we can build something universal like that, or even state by state, as is likely what's going to happen in the US, that would be perfect, because then we don't have to do the hard work to verify the voters. If somebody else has done it and that person is trusted and all the checks and balances are there, and we would happily use that.
Yeah, it's a tricky landscape though, because there's always going to be pushback on the government wanting too much information about me. I was even thinking, we do have an identity, at least like Social Security. Everybody has a Social Security card in the United States. But if you're asking for that for voting, that's definitely potentially intruding on people's privacy. You have to find that balance, I assume. I'm sure you've thought about this a lot.
Yeah, and also with the social security number, it's not an indicator of citizenship,
That's
right?
true. Right.
Because non-citizens can have that. It's more like for your
Or
tax,
residency for that matter.
right?
Right.
Yeah. So it's it's it can be one parameter, like you could use the last four digits
Sure.
to verify somebody,
Mm.
beyond something else. But just using it by itself, you're right, it's not sufficient because it doesn't give you all the information you need. So I think in terms of privacy, there are so many silos in government, right? Like the DMV, which issues you your driver's license,
Yeah.
right, or your state ID.
Are you going to replace the DMV? That would be awesome.
Well, I think right now that's the closest which you get to
Right.
kind of one entity which has sufficient information about you in
Sure.
most states, that you could use that as a singular identifying factor. And so if the DMV becomes an oracle on a chain, right,
Mm.
and you get an ID, it's verified, now there's an identifier on it, now somebody else wants to verify you using your ID, they don't necessarily need you to scan it again. They can go to the chain. They know that this is a trusted oracle because the DMV is a trusted
Yeah.
entity. And so I think that model is very likely to succeed. And there you don't have data leakage. You don't need to share your information again and again. It's one and done, and then protected until you change your ID or you move out of state. So that way you can minimize the risk of data falling into the wrong hands. And the other principle I think we should also encourage is don't write any personally identifying information to the chain yet, right? Regardless of how secure you think your chain is,
Mm.
most of our current encryption algorithms are going to break once quantum computing goes mainstream in a few years.
Sure.
And so you don't want to be in a situation where 10 years from now, somebody can go to the chain and reverse engineer all the personal data. So the best thing is don't write it. You don't need to write personal data to the chain, right? There are other ways to, secure that. And then keep kind of building this Oracle centric model where you start giving trusted entities the ability to verify stuff and then hash it, store an identifier, and then you reuse that. I think that model
Yeah.
could be very successful in the near future.
Yeah. That's great insight. And I like, I mean, everything you're doing sounds like it is the crossover of technology and culture, because it really, I mean, this sort of identity and security is going to be relevant, more and more relevant to everybody moving forward. Um, the on the current platform. So what is the user experience look like if I was to vote in an election?
Yeah, it's very similar to your traditional absentee voting process. So you
Mhm.
apply to your election clerk as a as an absentee voter. So typically it will be postal. Some states would be email or fax. So this is the new option, mobile.
Yeah.
And then once they approve you, you get an invitation to download the app. So you start with a email and a phone number, the same one you've provided to your local elections clerk.
Mhm.
Then once you're in the app, it'll ask you to scan a photo ID, government issued photo ID. So you can use a driver's license, state ID, passport. Those are the three main ones. You can use others as well.
Yeah.
And then take a selfie. So it matches you to the document. Make sure your document's valid, not malicious in any way. And then matches that data to your state voter registration file, which the jurisdiction provides us.
Mhm.
And everything's good. This usually takes a minute or two, unless there's some discrepancy. And then once it's done, identifier for your identity is created. It's stored securely on your phone hardware or a secure element, and all the documents you provide are deleted. and then it protects that identifier with your pseudo biometrics, your Face ID, fingerprint, or you can use a long pin. At that point, you're ready to receive your ballot. So 45 days before election day, your mobile ballot shows up. You can mark it. You sign on the screen. There's an affidavit as well, which absentee voters have to sign. It's like you sign the outside of your postal ballot envelope. It's the same thing. And then once you're ready, it anonymizes your ballot, and basically every oval is kind of multicast into the network as its own unique transaction. And then your clerk in your jurisdiction, they have access to the logbox. So on election day after 8 p.m., they can unlock. And the really nice thing is they are able to print an anonymous paper ballot from all your each individual oval transaction without knowing that this is a specific person's ballot. So
Did you say
anonymity is,
print?
yes. And so
So
they
that
print
still has
that.
to happen, right? Every ballot has to be printed.
Yes, because unfortunately the regulations haven't caught up here yet where you can do a digital tabulation. Like, it would be great if they can do the tabulation directly on the chain, which we can unofficially, right? They can do it, but the official still has to happen on paper. So it's kind of a interesting way where you're using a modern system, but it still integrates with the legacy system, because otherwise people wouldn't be able to use it, right? So that's a choice you have to make. Do you wait for regulation to catch up, or you at least get started, like get your foot in the door, let people start using it, and eventually the officials will realize, we actually don't need this paper, but it's a nice to have. So if you look at Canada, they don't print. It's all digital. So they've evolved one step further. Similarly, Estonia doesn't print.
Right.
So I think it's just kind of a cycle which governments have to go through. Unfortunately, the US is a lot slower.
That's fascinating. You could have 50,000 people vote remotely through Voatz in a US election, and
it will produce 50,000 paper ballots
they'll
which are
print the
tabulated on
ballot,
the machines.
and someone could still lose one of the boxes of ballots or is the tabulation done before that?
Yeah, they wouldn't be able to lose them, because what happens is
wasn't that an accusation in the previous presidential election that I guess those were written ballots?
Postal ballots, postal ballots, because they're coming from different places. So in this case, what happens is the printing happens in the tabulation room, the election, where the election officials are sitting after 8 p.m. And their basic checks, like they can see on the dashboard, in this precinct 54 people voted, so there have to be 54 paper ballots printed. So if there's a discrepancy, they'll know right away. And then when they feed them into the tabulator machines and it says 53, no, there's one missing. So we haven't had a case where they've messed it up, because they will instantly see a discrepancy, they can catch it, and then kind of rectify it. So it's a good way actually to make sure you don't make a mistake on the paper front.
And so the user experience is completely on mobile, is that?
Yes, so the mobile is the primary channel. So you can use it on an iPhone or Android phone. You can even use tablets. We do have a backup, a web-based version, which doesn't have all the accessibility features and security features in the app, but it's for some reason can't use the app, doesn't have a compatible phone for any reason, can't get an alternative device, they can, as a special case, go to a website and vote, and it would still generate the paper ballot as a PDF, and the clerk will then print it. But most of our voters use the app.
Makes sense. Now you're in the Boston area, and I think you went to undergrad and grad school in Boston.
I went to grad school at Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh.
Okay, in Pittsburgh. Okay. Has I guess the culture of where you are? I mean, Carnegie Mellon is an engineering capital of the world, so I'm sure that has influenced you. How about Carnegie Mellon, Pittsburgh, and Massachusetts or Boston area for that matter? Has that affected your approach to any of the work that you're doing?
I would say a little bit. I mean, one of the reasons I guess we were lucky to be in Massachusetts, in Boston, was our first couple of clients were both the major state parties. So both major state parties have used our system for their internal elections.
Nice.
So, and they are very, both their head offices used to be walking distance from our office, which was very coincidental. So I think it was good kind of to get started there, get feedback. I mean, obviously it's a great place for technology, not just, traditional technology, but, biotech, fintech. So it's a great hub for that. It's also, there's the counter side where things don't move as fast as you might want, even though Massachusetts is a very tech-friendly state. From an industry perspective, I think the government is always appears to be a little on the slower side compared to some of the other states. So yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag in that sense, but it's really nice to be in the area. There's a lot of intellectual activity, which is beneficial. Lots of people who support us, lots of people who are against us. So it's good to have a good mix and match. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's also appropriate that that you're being in Boston. One of the hotbeds of the original U.S. government, adoption and drawing up some of the early governance papers of the United States, and really a lot of the early decisions on how governance works and elections work in this country.
Yeah, there's a lot of history here. Yeah,
there's a lot of history. There really is. I mean, U.S. doesn't have like so many historical places, and we were talking about this before. I was in Boston this past weekend, and it really is. It's a historical city. Yeah. There aren't so many historical cities in the U.S., but it feels like you're at the sort of the birthplace of America, or one of the birthplaces of America when you're there.
Yeah, that's one of the really nice things about being here. Yeah, you kind of feel that history.
Yeah. So, and how about you as a CEO, as an entrepreneur? What's your daily? What does your day look like? I mean, what are you spending most of your time on these days?
I think it's very there's a lot of hustle, right? There's so many things to do. We are a very small company, and we are operating in a space which is not designed for startups, right? So we're trying to change some hard entrenched ideas.
Sure.
So we're always, looking. It's always need to have more funding, make sure we don't mess up any elections which are happening, and looking for new people to try out our system. So I think that keeps your 24 hours busy. You kind of hope there were more hours in the day.
Yeah.
So it's a very it's a busy day, busy schedule. Not many holidays or weekends.
Right.
But we really like this work. We feel like it's very meaningful, and we are helping people with every election, and also trying to kind of push back on a very negative narrative from a cybersecurity perspective, where people feel like you can't do anything safely on the internet. And our pushback is, no, that's not true. You can do things safely on the internet. People are doing it. You just don't hear about it in the news because bad news sells more than good news.
Sure.
But you can, and if you can send people to the moon and soon to Mars, then you should be able to vote safely online in this day and world, especially in America. So
yeah. Do you have a few whales that you have your eyes on in terms of elections or governments that you'd like to be use votes with?
Yeah, so we're looking obviously more states in the US, but there's a lot of interest coming our way from international governments. So a
Yep.
lot of governments in Central and South America, in Africa as well, in Southeast Asia, and then some of the European countries as well, because I think going through this 2-3 years of COVID, a lot of governments have realized that there needs to be a better way to do things, especially when it comes to e-governance, and
Sure.
voting is a key aspect of that. And
Yep.
so there's a lot of interest, and so we are constantly responding to project proposals, RFIs, RFPs, and doing demonstrations, and hopefully that translates into bigger projects, bigger elections. So we are excited. It's feels like you're on a cusp of something exciting that's going to happen in many parts of the world.
Yeah. Are there competing systems or companies?
So there are what we call as the traditional online voting
Mhm.
companies, where you can just use a web browser and vote. So there are several of them. There's
That doesn't sound
Smartmatic.
very secure.
Yeah, I mean, it's because you're not really relying on any hardware-based security. So it's basically user-based credential, and if somebody gets access to your credential, then there's no way to know
Mm.
it's the real person or somebody else. So some places have used that in the past. So our key differentiator is being able to use hardware-based security and making it really hard for somebody to break that, and then not having a single point of failure. So in that respect, I think we are very unique. As far as we know, it's the only app-based, biometrics enabled, and blockchain backed election system to be
Mm.
used successfully by governments and major political parties anywhere in the world. So kind of early pioneers, but still very small.
Yeah. Well, growing. Do you have partners? Like other, like I'm thinking like credentialing companies and or communities. Who else do you work with?
So we do the ID verification piece in-house right
Okay.
now.
Yep.
So we're not using a third party at the moment. And one of the reasons is then we don't have to share the data with anybody, right? So that becomes a sort of a sensitive issue.
Sure.
If we share data with somebody, and even if they promise to delete it, because we don't want to store people's IDs and face pictures
Right.
beyond the first 24 hours, because we don't want to have, malicious actors another reason to want to come and break the infrastructure. So you don't, the motto is, if you don't need it, don't store it, right? Kind of reduce
Mhm.
your security footprint and the risk. So that becomes a challenge. So we try to minimize sort of that aspect. We do work very closely with AWS and Azure. So we use a lot of their infrastructure, which is kind of self-contained. And then we collaborate with sort of other industry partners, like on the cybersecurity front, also the traditional paper ballot vendors, because remember, the paper ballot we produce has to be scannable on
Yeah.
the machine. So we work with all the major providers to make sure we maintain that compatibility. And sort of the cybersecurity folks in our industry who are looking to do new things with us.
Yeah. I certainly, I've always thought of voting as one of the potential use cases for blockchain technology. Encryption, secure identification, maintenance of anonymity. It sort of has all the components that are necessary. I guess I've kind of been waiting for you to come along in it. So this is great to see, and I suspect that you will have huge adoption over the next few years. I think the technology is being it's being more and more accepted on different fronts. People are starting to trust it more, and there's a need here.
Oh, thank you for your kind words. Yeah, we sure hope so. I think hope more people will try it out, adopt it, and hopefully take advantage of, like you said, the new digitization and traceability and auditability. I think that's also really important, and blockchain is one of the best ways to do that.
Yeah. So if a municipality or an organization of any sort wants to use the Voatz technology, how do they find you? How do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, the easiest way would be to send us an email. We are at info@voatz.com. They can also go to our website, hit the contact button, and just send us a note. And we're pretty quick in getting back, and we're happy to work with anyone. So yeah, we're looking forward to it.
That's great. I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on today. This has been really educational and fascinating, and groundbreaking stuff. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Nimit.